Welcome to the debate. What if I told you the exact same glass of milk contains one protein that drastically lowers your blood sugar and, well, another protein that actively spikes it?
Right, it completely messes with how we normally view nutrition.
Exactly. For decades, we've looked at nutritional labels as if they were simple accounting ledgers. You see the calcium, you see the saturated fat, and you assume, you know exactly what that food is doing to your body.
We do love to put our nutrients into neat little columns of good and bad.
We really do. But when you actually step into the world of the dairy matrix, that ledger becomes completely useless. So today, we're examining the highly complex role of daily dairy consumption in cardiometabolic health and nutrient adequacy.
Based on some fascinating recent clinical trials and nutritional reviews.
Right. And the central question we have to grapple with today is this. Does the unique structural matrix of dairy foods inherently enhance our cardiometabolic health, or do its wildly variable microscopic fractions, along with its high levels of saturated fat and sodium, complicate its role in a healthy diet?
And it's a critical question, frankly, because how we answer it dictates what millions of people put in their grocery carts every single week.
Exactly. So I'll be arguing that the dairy matrix is a net positive functional food. When you look at the architecture of dairy, it actively improves metabolic markers. I mean, we have profound clinical evidence showing how specific dairy formats reduce systemic inflammation.
Right, the matrix effect.
Yeah, and how the proteins trapped within that matrix actively enhance insulin sensitivity.
And I'll be taking the opposing view here. I am arguing that the health benefits of dairy are highly conditional and absolutely faction-specific.
Conditional how?
Well, making blanket recommendations for daily dairy consumption completely ignores the detrimental effects that certain milk fractions have on our glucose regulation. And honestly, it ignores the immense real-world risk of excessive sodium and saturated fat intake.
Okay, let's start by laying the foundation for why we even care about dairy at a population level. First and foremost, dairy's an irreplaceable vehicle for nutrient adequacy.
Sure.
Epidemiological modeling shows us that consuming the recommended amounts of dairy provides vital calcium, potassium, high-quality protein, and vitamin B12. These are nutrients the general public chronically underconsumes.
I mean, nobody is arguing that calcium isn't important.
True, but here is where it gets interesting. Beyond just the raw numbers of calcium or fat, there's what scientists call the food matrix effect.
Right.
This is the observed phenomenon that saturated fat, when consumed within the complex physical structure of dairy, it doesn't carry the same cardiovascular risks as the exact same amount of saturated fat from, say, a piece of meat.
And we really need to explain why that happens structurally for the audience.
Right, so in dairy, the fat is wrapped in something called milk fat globule membranes, or MFGM. Think of the dairy matrix like a biological time-release capsule.
Okay.
The complex structure of the dairy slows down how quickly the saturated fat hits the bloodstream, unlike the fat in a steak, which basically floods the system all at once. Because of that membrane, the matrix fundamentally alters our lipid metabolism.
That's a nice theory, but
And add to that the bioactive potential of dairy like goat cheese naturally enriched with omega-3s, which clinical trials show actively decreases systemic inflammation, and you have a powerful functional tool for metabolic health.
you're painting a very rosy picture of a biological time-release capsule. But let's look at what else is inside that capsule. Viewing dairy as a uniformly beneficial category is a vast and, frankly, a dangerous oversimplification.
Dangerous in what way? I mean, we're talking about whole foods.
Dangerous because we cannot ignore the macro-level dietary impact. Dairy is a primary dietary source of sodium and saturated fat. In the United States alone, dairy contributes up to 11% of total sodium intake and about 26% of saturated fat intake.
Well, sure, standard American diets are high in those.
But these are known, heavily documented drivers of hypertension and cardiovascular disease. You just can't talk about the benefits of potassium in milk while ignoring the massive hit of salt in the cheese.
But again, the matrix.
The matrix doesn't magically neutralize sodium. And furthermore, specific components of dairy have wildly different metabolic effects. We talk about dairy proteins lowering blood sugar, right? But the clinical data is much more nuanced.
Nuanced, but still positive.
Not always. While some whey proteins might lower glucose, specific major fractions of that whey, like beta-lactoglobulin, actually elevate glucose and elevate glucagon in type 2 diabetics.
Wait, the benefits of dairy are highly dependent on the exact microscopic fraction and the exact dietary context? It's not a universal guarantee.
Okay, let's dive right into that tension then. You mentioned the cheese, so let's look at the lipid and inflammatory impacts of the cheese matrix. There's a fascinating 12-week clinical trial involving 68 overweight and obese subjects.
The goat cheese study.
Yes, the goat cheese study. And these weren't healthy athletes, right? These were individuals with at least 2 risk factors for cardiovascular disease.
Which is an important distinction.
Definitely. So they were given 60 grams per day of a goat cheese that was naturally enriched with omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUAFAs, and conjugated linoleic acid, or CLA.
Okay.
The results were striking. Consuming this specific dairy matrix significantly increased HDL, our good cholesterol, and apolipoprotein B.
Right.
But even more importantly, it drastically decreased high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, or CRP, by 36%.
And just for the listener, CRP is essentially a distress signal from the liver. Like when there's systemic inflammation in the body, CRP shoots up.
Exactly. So a 36% drop in that distress signal is massive. It proves that a dairy matrix can be deployed to actively suppress inflammation and improve cardiovascular risk profiles in highly vulnerable populations.
Wait, hold on. We need to stop and look at the control group for a second, because there is a massive edge case hiding right there in the data.
I wouldn't call it hiding.
Well, you're citing the experimental group who ate the enriched cheese. What happened to the people eating the normal cheese?
They served as the baseline comparison.
They didn't just serve as a baseline. The control group was eating 60 grams a day of regular unenriched goat cheese. Over that same 12-week period, their CRP didn't drop. It didn't even stay the same.
Well,
Their systemic inflammation spiked by 37%.
because the regular cheese lacked the PUFA enrichment. That's the whole point of the study.
Exactly my point. If the cheese matrix itself was inherently anti-inflammatory, we wouldn't see a massive near 40% spike in inflammatory markers from the standard everyday dairy product.
But
The anti-inflammatory benefit in the experimental group came from the specific omega-3 enrichment and, crucially, the concurrent weight loss. They were on a hypocaloric diet.
Yes, they were losing weight.
Right, and the data shows that CRP decreases by 0.13 milligrams per deciliter for every single kilogram of weight loss. The cheese was simply the delivery vehicle for the omega-3s, not the driver of the health benefit.
Hold on, you're looking at the cheese just as a passive delivery vehicle, like a cardboard box holding a shipment of omega-3s. But the clinical evidence suggests the matrix is actively functional.
Functional how?
Is it just a Trojan horse for omega-3s, or does the cheese matrix itself functionally facilitate the absorption and synergistic effect of those fatty acids to lower atherogenic risk?
I mean, it's just fat acting as a lipid carrier.
It's more than that. The unique structure of the cheese, the exact way the lipids are emulsified and bound with proteins and calcium, dictates how those omega-3s are metabolized. We know from the literature that replacing omega-6 fatty acids with omega-3s in the membranes of immune-active cells reduces pro-inflammatory compounds.
Sure, yes.
So the dairy matrix literally protects these delicate PUFAs during the harsh process of digestion and optimizes their uptake into the cells. You can't just separate the nutrient from its structural housing. The matrix is what makes the intervention so highly effective.
Okay, fine. The delivery system is effective at protecting the omega-3s. But if the standard version of that delivery system, regular goat cheese, the kind someone actually buys at the grocery store, raises a primary inflammatory marker by nearly 40% in an at-risk population, we cannot call the category inherently beneficial. It's wildly conditional.
Well, let's shift gears then. You're focusing heavily on the fats in that cheese matrix, but let's look at the protein trapped inside it, specifically their direct impact on blood sugar and insulin, because this is where the functional power of dairy becomes, frankly, undeniable.
If you look at very specific parts of it, maybe?
Dairy proteins, particularly whey, are incredibly rich in branched-chain amino acids, like leucine.
Right, the muscle-building amino acids.
Yes, but they do much more than build muscle. When you consume these dairy proteins, they potently stimulate insulin secretion and incretin hormones, specifically GIP and GLP-1 from the gut.
Ah, the same hormones targeted by modern weight loss drugs like Ozempic.
Precisely. Dairy naturally triggers that pathway. It creates an insulinotropic effect. If you consume whey protein before a meal, it basically primes the pancreas.
Right.
The pancreas releases insulin early, resulting in significantly lower postprandial glucose excursions, meaning your blood sugar doesn't aggressively spike after you eat.
Okay, but
This specific biological mechanism perfectly explains why epidemiological studies consistently link the consumption of low-fat and fermented dairy to a reduced risk of developing type 2 diabetes. The dairy protein matrix is actively managing the body's glucose.
I disagree with how broadly you're applying that mechanism. You're treating whey as a monolith, and the microscopic fractions tell a completely different and frankly concerning story.
I mean, whey is the primary liquid protein in dairy. It is a unified component.
But it's made up of several different subfractions, and the largest one, making up 50 to 60% of all whey, is a protein called beta-lactoglobulin, or BLG.
Right, BLG.
In a recent randomized double-blind crossover trial involving patients with type 2 diabetes, researchers isolated BLG and compared it to a standard whey protein isolate, or WPI.
And both of them stimulated insulin.
Yes. When these diabetics consumed the BLG pre-meal, it did increase insulin by 10%. But paradoxically, it elevated glucagon by 20%. And it actually elevated interstitial fluid glucose by 10% compared to the WPI.
Well, let's pause and explain glucagon for the listener, because that's the kicker here.
Gladly. Glucagon is essentially the biological brake to insulin's gas pedal. While insulin tells your body to store blood sugar, glucagon tells your liver to dump its stored glucose into the bloodstream.
But the incretin response from the gut, the GLP-1, was comparable between the two fractions. The body was still trying to manage the sugar.
It was trying, yes, but the specific amino acid profile of the BLG fraction overrode it. BLG has naturally higher levels of methionine and tyrosine.
Right.
Those specific amino acids heavily stimulate the pancreas to secrete glucagon, so the liver dumps glucose into the blood, entirely neutralizing the benefit of the insulin spike.
It's a competing mechanism, sure.
Exactly. And it gets worse. We know that chronic overstimulation of insulin via excessive branched-chain amino acids can activate the mTOR kinase pathway.
Right. The mTOR pathway, essentially the body's cellular growth engine?
Yes, and when that engine is left running too hot from a constant flood of amino acids, it actually triggers the skeletal muscles to resist insulin over time. So, telling a diabetic to just consume dairy proteins is rolling the dice. Are they getting a fraction that naturally lowers their blood sugar, or are they getting a fraction that actively raises it while potentially worsening insulin resistance?
Honestly, I think you're looking at the data upside down.
Upside down?
Yes. If we know from that very same study that the whey protein isolate successfully lowered the interstitial fluid glucose by 2 millimoles per liter and reduced overall glycemic variability by up to 15%, aren't we simply refining our understanding of which fraction works best?
Refining implies we aren't changing the fundamental nature of the food.
But we're isolating the beneficial mechanism. It's like finding the exact active compound in a medicinal plant. The raw material, the dairy protein, is inherently valuable. We are just utilizing advanced clinical proteomics to figure out that WPI is the optimal therapeutic fraction for a diabetic rather than the raw BLG.
But that's not...
It doesn't negate the metabolic value of dairy. It highlights our evolving precision in how to apply it clinically.
But people don't eat fractions in the real world. They don't go to the grocery store and buy a block of WPI. They eat whole foods.
Sometimes they buy protein powders.
Sure, but mostly they eat a slice of cheddar cheese, which contains massive amounts of that BLG. When you isolate the WPI, you are actually proving my point. You have to heavily process, extract, and curate the dairy to get a reliable benefit, because the natural unrefined matrix contains components that simultaneously raise glucose and glucagon.
Which brings us to the most important part of this debate. How do we translate these clinical nuances into actionable dietary behavior? Because if you're listening to this and wondering what to grab at the grocery store, you need a practical takeaway.
Absolutely.
Having established the functional capabilities of these matrices, the actionable takeaway is that we can confidently incorporate 3 to 5 portions of dairy into a daily diet to ensure nutrient adequacy.
Wait, 3 to 5 portions of any dairy?
No, we do it intelligently. The evidence strongly supports choosing a mix of whole and fermented dairy matrices, like yogurts, kefirs, and specific aged or enriched cheeses.
Okay, fermented is better.
Yes, fermented dairy in particular harnesses anti-inflammatory polar lipids. Plus, the fermentation process provides live bacterial cultures that positively modulate the gut microbiome, which further aids in metabolic regulation. This structural variety optimizes metabolic flexibility and provides the calcium and high-quality protein the population desperately needs.
I strongly caution against giving the public a generic eat 3 to 5 portions of dairy rule. It's actually quite dangerous when you look at how people really eat.
Why is it dangerous if they're aiming for fermented or whole matrices?
Because we have to look at the macro-level epidemiological data, like the PURE study. The PURE study tracked over 136,000 individuals across 21 countries over years. The data clearly shows that while yogurt and milk might lower cardiovascular risk, cheese often does not show that same protective association.
Well, because cheese is highly calorie dense.
Not just calories, it's the sodium and the saturated fat we discussed earlier. We have to demand precision in our recommendations. Consumers must specifically seek out reduced fat, low sodium, or specifically fermented products.
Right, which is what I said.
But if you tell the public to just eat 3 to 5 portions of dairy, they aren't reaching for plain kefir. They're going to reach for the heavily salted cheddar cheese or the processed American slices. High habitual intake of standard cheese without discrimination is going to exacerbate hypertension due to the sodium, and it will push saturated fat limits into the red zone. We cannot ignore human behavior in a real-world dietary pattern.
I'm just not convinced by that logic. I mean, we don't discard the entire vegetable category just because French fries exist and people might choose to eat them, right?
That's a bit of a false equivalence.
We don't throw out the immense metabolic benefits of the dairy matrix because someone might choose a highly processed, high-sodium cheese. The goal of nutritional science is education. Can we agree that guiding the public towards specific fermented dairy, like yogurt and PUFA-enriched matrices, offers a clear, evidence-based path to improving daily diet quality? We have the clinical mechanisms to prove exactly how it works.
We can absolutely agree that specific, highly curated dairy products have medicinal and metabolic value. But we must communicate to the public that the baseline effects of general dairy consumption are a tightrope walk between metabolic benefit and metabolic risk.
A tightrope walk.
Yes. The margin for error regarding sodium intake and the risk of consuming specific glucagon-stimulating fractions like BLG is simply too thin for blanket recommendations.
So to summarize our positions in light of the clinical data, my perspective remains that the structural matrix of dairy, alongside its incredibly dense nutrient profile and its bioactive proteins, provides an unmatched functional dietary tool.
Unmatched is a strong word.
Well, whether it's suppressing postprandial glucose excursions via whey protein isolates priming the pancreas, or delivering anti-inflammatory polar lipids in a complex fermented matrix, dairy actively improves cardiometabolic health when it's intelligently applied.
And my summary is that the clinical evidence absolutely demands caution, because different milk fractions and different cheese matrices can simultaneously raise blood sugar, spike glucagon, and elevate inflammatory markers like CRP, depending entirely on the specific product and the person's diet. Dairy must be curated very carefully.
Right.
It cannot be consumed indiscriminately without risking negative cardiovascular and metabolic outcomes.
Fair enough.
We clearly acknowledge our continued disagreement on whether the baseline population-level effects of general dairy consumption are a net positive or a metabolic risk.
We do. However, I think we've reached a really strong point of convergence on the underlying mechanism itself.
The matrix.
Exactly. We both agree that the food matrix, the specific microscopic way that nutrients are structurally packaged in foods, like aged cheese versus isolated whey fractions, fundamentally dictates how the human body metabolizes fat and protein.
Absolutely. A gram of fat or a gram of protein behaves entirely differently inside the body depending on the structural housing it arrives in. I mean, the time-release mechanism of the MFGM, the way proteins trigger incretins, it shows the incredible value of looking past broad, monolithic food categories to understand the microscopic fractions that actually drive our biological health.
It really does challenge how we look at our food.
It does. There is so much more nuance to explore in the clinical data regarding the dairy matrix, and we encourage everyone listening to dive into the research to evaluate their own daily nutritional choices. Because it turns out, when you step back and look at that nutritional label on your milk or cheese, the true story of your health isn't just in the numbers, it's in the microscopic architecture holding those numbers together.